There is a building at the corner of Beacon Street and Charlesgate East in Boston that may capture all of the haunted mystery of one of America's oldest cities. Turrets rise from its roofline, conical towers jut skyward. Limestone and aged brick climb 7 stories into the Boston sky. The architecture is elaborate, almost compulsive in its ornamentation, as though whoever built it was trying to say something that words could not contain. From 1981 to 1995, that building was an Emerson College dormitory known simply as Charlesgate. Students slept, studied, lived, and loved here, and many of them left with stories they still cannot explain. Doors slamming in empty hallways, toilets flushing on their own. A little girl glimpsed on the 3rd floor gone before anyone could look twice. A thick black fog hovering over a sleeping student that crossed the room and passed through a solid wall. A Ouija board spelling out the same message again and again, unprompted, in a room where the lights would not stay on. The only thing more disturbing than the stories of the hauntings is the history of the building itself. Charlesgate was the dream of Pickering Putnam, one of Boston's most accomplished architects in the late 19th century. Born in 1847, he was educated at the Boston Latin School, then Harvard College, then some of the prestigious academies in Europe. He was a man of undeniable talent and formidable ambition. He had designed homes throughout Boston's Back Bay, but he had never built anything like what he was envisioning in 1890. Putnam designed Charlesgate as a cooperative apartment hotel inspired in part by Edward Bellamy's utopian novel Looking Backward, a book that envisioned a future Boston of grand public architecture, shared community spaces, and a new model of civilized urban living. The building was intended to reflect those ideals. It would have a central garden, a communal dining room, an atmosphere of refined communal life. Putnam was not just the architect. He and members of his family financed the construction themselves. The basement and 1st floor were constructed of Indiana limestone, the remainder of brick, with limestone trimmings throughout. The building incorporated elements of several architectural styles, with the short grouped columns around the doors and the rounded arches over the windows and doorways. Inside, glazed terracotta tilework lined the entrances and lobby. The building occupied an irregularly shaped lot with street frontage on Beacon, Charlesgate East, and Marlborough. In 1892, Putnam acquired the neighboring Barnes townhouse and built it up to match the height of the original structure, extending Charlesgate's western facade the entire length of Charlesgate East between Beacon and Marlborough. The building was named after Charlesgate Park, created by landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted as part of Boston's Emerald Necklace Park system. Olmsted had designed Charlesgate Park to serve as the connection point between the Back Bay Fens and Charles River. Charlesgate Hotel sat at the edge of that green corridor, positioned to overlook water and parkland in a city that was, at the time, one of the wealthiest and most culturally vibrant in America. When the building opened in the early 1890s, it accepted both transient guests and long-term residents. The emphasis, however, was always on permanent tenants. Unlike other grand Boston hotels of the era, Charlesgate had no ballroom and no bar. Management at one point boasted that they had never served a drop of liquor on the premises. It was a quiet residential hotel, dignified and discreet, catering to Boston's upper class. Pickering Putnam moved in with his wife Grace the moment the building was complete. He lived there for the rest of his life, as on February 23, 1917, he died inside of it. The Boston Globe announced his death with a brief notice describing him as one of Boston's leading architects and the inventor of improved styles of plumbing, steam heating, and water purification appliances. He was 60 years old. His death, by all recorded accounts, was from natural causes. But the fact that he died inside the building he had built with his own family's money, the building he had never left, would eventually become one strand in a much darker mythology. Rumors would later circulate that he had taken his own life. Those rumors were false, but they persisted. Grace Putnam, his wife, remained in residence at Charlesgate for 30 years after his death. By the time she finally left, the building had changed hands. Hotelier Herbert Summers had acquired it in 1923 and ran it as a quiet residential establishment until his death in 1937. His wife Fanny remained, and ownership passed within the family until 1947. At that point, the building that Putnam had built as a monument to cooperative urban living was sold to Boston University for use as a female dormitory. The renovations that followed were not kind to Charlesgate. Walls came down, apartments were subdivided. The architectural logic of Putnam's original floor plan was interrupted and rearranged to accommodate dormitory-style housing. The building that had functioned as a coherent residential whole was fragmented. Rooms that had made sense in context no longer did. Spaces that had served clear functions were sealed off, repurposed, or forgotten entirely. It was during the Boston University years that the first serious haunting stories began to circulate. One room in the building acquired a reputation for being particularly haunted, linked to the alleged death of a student who had taken his own life there. Boston University held the building from 1947 to 1973, and by the time the institution sold it, Charlesgate had already accumulated a layer of dark folklore. Emerson students in later years would claim to see the spirits of young women who had died in the building during the BU era. Investigations by Emerson's archivist Robert Fleming and writers from the college's own student newspaper found no documented cases of students taking their lives during this period. But the stories existed regardless, passed from class to class, living independently of whatever the records said. There was one death in the building, however, that was verifiable and well documented. A Boston Globe article from March 15, 1908 reported on Westwood T. Windram taking his own life. Windram suffered from insomnia and shot himself with a revolver in his apartment while his wife slept in an adjacent room. Windram was a partner in a shoe-binding manufacturing firm. He was not a student, he was not a mobster, he was a businessman who had been plagued by sleeplessness. He died alone in the early morning hours in a room at Charlesgate. According to stories that circulated in later decades, an alarm clock in that room would go off every morning at the same time, unprompted, as if something in the space were locked into the hour when Windram died. After Boston University sold the property in 1973, Charlesgate entered its darkest period before the Emerson years. The building became a rooming house, serving both upper-class college students from nearby schools and some of the more marginal residents of the Back Bay. Charlesgate, which had been built as a model of refined urban living, was now subdivided, cheaply maintained, and occupied by a rotating population with no particular ties to the building or to each other. It was during this rooming house period that one of the stranger claims about Charlesgate emerged. Some accounts reported that a cult had taken up residence in the building before Emerson College purchased it, and that when Emerson students first moved in, the building was not entirely filled with enrolled students. It was said to not be unusual for a student to walk past an open door and find a group of occupants chanting inside. This claim was never substantiated. No cult has been identified by name, no members tracked down. But the story became part of Charlesgate's reputation, and it was detailed enough in its specifics to be repeated widely. Emerson College purchased Charlesgate in 1981. Emerson was and remains a school focused on communications, the arts, and media. Its students were, by institutional design, creative, perceptive, and attuned to narrative. They were also, by the nature of young adulthood, susceptible to the pull of a good ghost story. Charlesgate gave them material that did not require embellishment. The building looked, on its face, like somewhere things had happened. The towers. The recessed windows, the ornamental tilework in the lobby, the 8th floor which could not be seen from the outside of the building for reasons Putnam had never explained. The east wing, shaped in a way that made portions of it visible only to residents in the building directly across the street. The hidden geometry of the structure suggested intention. Students naturally began to ask what that intention had been. One of the most persistent stories concerned the elevator. Putnam had commissioned a decorative wall tile bearing the likeness of his daughter Elsa and had it placed near the elevator during the building's original construction in 1891. The tile was not unusual for the era. Architectural ornamentation often included personalized elements, but the legend that grew up around it was unusual. According to the story, 7-year-old Elsa Putnam had been playing in the hotel with a ball when the ball rolled toward the elevator shaft. Elsa ran after it and fell. The tile bearing her image cracked at the exact moment of her death. And her spirit, the story went, had wandered the hallways of Charlesgate ever since, still searching for her ball, still looking for someone to play with. The problem with that story is that it is not true. Elsa Putnam did not die as a child. She lived into the 1970s and had several children of her own. The tragic child ghost at the center of Charlesgate's most famous legend was a fiction, almost certainly assembled from the detail of the real tile and the imaginative energy of dormitory legend-making. And yet Emerson students reported seeing her. Descriptions clustered around the third floor. A small figure, a young girl, gone before she could be approached. Comments from Emerson alumni recalled seeing a little girl on the third floor, papers flying across rooms, and Ouija boards producing disturbing results. The student paper, the Berkeley Beacon, covered the haunting multiple times. The now-defunct Boston Phoenix ran its own pieces. Emerson's own administration could not entirely ignore what was being reported. According to a February 1990 article in Fate magazine, Ouija boards were allegedly banned from Charlesgate because of their psychological effects on students, specifically due to evil messages being produced. Whether an official ban was ever actually enforced is contested. Alumni who lived there during that same period have said clearly that Ouija boards were commonplace in the building, that no enforcement of any ban ever occurred, and that one resident advisor even featured a board at a Halloween gathering in the sixth-floor lounge. The institutional record on the ban is unclear. What is clear is that the boards were in heavy use and that the sessions being conducted inside Charlesgate were generating stories that spread well beyond the building itself. Several of those accounts have been recorded in enough detail to stand on their own. And there are enough accounts that at times, Charlesgate ranked as one of the most haunted dorms in America. One student reported waking in the night to find a thick, black fog suspended directly above him in his room. He could not move. He lay completely still as the mass drifted across the room and passed through the solid wall beside him. When he later examined the wall, he discovered that it had been sealed over a hidden room behind it. The room had been closed off at some point during the building's many renovations. Whether anything had occurred in that room or whether the discovery of it was simply the result of a wall being where no wall should architecturally have been, was never determined. Another account involved a student who had been in the shower when the bathroom light began to flicker. He reached up to tighten the bulb. Water had pooled on the floor beneath him. The circuit he was completing with his wet hand and the damp floor put him seconds away from serious electrocution. In the next room, his friends were using a Ouija board. The board, according to those friends, had begun spelling ha 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 before the shower incident occurred. When they asked it why, it responded ACDC 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 in relation to the electricity. One student reportedly left his door open for his roommates who were out for the evening. Awakened from his sleep by the noise of someone moving around the room, the student asked if anyone was there as he didn't see anyone present. The second the question was asked, the door slammed shut, sending the student running from the empty room. Other Emerson students reported cold gusts of air coming from nowhere, drawer handles rattling, toilets flushing on their own, and sightings of apparitions. On the ground level, some students reported seeing what they described as glowing shapes of horses that had died in a flood, in an area where a stable had supposedly once stood. One story told of a benevolent spirit who kept slamming open a window every time the student in her room spoke of an abusive boyfriend. When the student broke up with the boyfriend, the window stopped slamming open. One apparition, described by multiple witnesses independently, was referred to as the Man in Black. He was consistently reported near the elevators. The predominant theory among students who discussed him was that he was connected to the mafia stories, either a victim or a perpetrator. The mafia claim held that organized crime had purchased or controlled Charlesgate at some point in the early 20th century, had used the building for criminal operations, and had executed people inside it, specifically in the elevator shaft. 3 bodies, according to some versions of the story. The 8th floor, invisible from the outside, was cited as proof of criminal design built directly into the architecture. None of this is supported by documented evidence. Charlesgate was built roughly 25 years before Boston had any established organized crime presence of the kind described in the legend. Researchers who examined ownership records, city documents, and building histories in the 1980s and 1990s found no verified connection to organized crime. Emerson's own archivist Robert Fleming conducted a significant portion of that research and found no documented murders or executions in the building. The 8th floor's invisibility from the street remains unexplained, but there is no evidence that it was concealed for illegal purposes. The ghost of J. Pickering Putnam himself was reportedly seen by some students. This claim is harder to debunk because, unlike Elsa's legend, Putnam actually did die inside the building. He spent more than 2 decades living in a structure he had conceived, financed, and built with his own hands. Putnam's attachment to the building during his life certainly makes a case that his spirit could remain attached to it even after death. There was a rumor that Putnam himself had been a member of an occult organization. The story held that Charlesgate was not just built to house people but to draw something in. That it had been deliberately constructed using specific materials intended to attract paranormal activity. The building's design genuinely did include elements that seemed to resist ordinary explanation. The hidden floor. The C-shaped east wing. The ornamental choices that exceeded what decorative convention alone could account for. The researchers who combed through Charlesgate's history in the 1980s and 1990s. They checked municipal records, ownership histories, newspaper archives, and institutional files. They found no murders, no verified cases of students taking their own lives, no organized crime connection. The Berkeley Beacon ran its major feature on Charlesgate haunting in 1989. By that point, Emerson had owned the building for 8 years and the stories had already stratified into layers. The older accounts had become folklore. The newer accounts were still being generated by freshmen who arrived each fall and found themselves sleeping in rooms that had histories they had not asked for. Emerson sold Charlesgate in 1995. The sale occurred when Emerson relocated its dormitories to the little building across the street from the Boston Common. By 1998, the building had been converted into 56 condominium units. The turrets and towers are still there, the limestone base is still there, the ornamental tilework in the lobby is still there. No one who has lived in the condos has gone on record with a significant paranormal encounter, at least not publicly. One possible interpretation is that the hauntings were always a product of collegiate imagination, of young people in an atmospheric building who wanted their experience to mean something more than classes and cafeteria food. Another interpretation is that whatever was in Charlesgate was attached to the energy of the students themselves and left when they did. A third interpretation, held by those who take the paranormal seriously, is that whatever residual presence exists in that building is simply quieter now. That it has learned patience. That it has been there for over 100 years and is not in any particular hurry. The quiet may also be explained by the absence of Ouija boards being used by overzealous students disturbing whatever spirits were trying to rest. Charlesgate is still standing at the corner of Beacon Street and Charlesgate East. It has a way of staying with people. The students who lived there between 1981 and 1995 have talked about it for 30 years. The stories have not thinned with time. If anything, they have sharpened. The details remain specific: the little girl on the 3rd floor, the fog that crossed the room, the Ouija board and the alternating current, the man in black beside the elevator. The invisible forces slamming doors and windows. The tile on the wall with the face of a child who never actually died there except in the story, which is the place where she has lived the longest. J. Pickering Putnam built Charlesgate to be a home. What he got in the end was something more permanent than any of that. He got a building that people cannot stop talking about long after he was gone. And whether by spirits or memories of youth, Charlesgate remains a building that continues to haunt. Subscribe to Paranormal Depths for the strangest and most compelling cases from around the world.